Hello everybody, and Kill Team Typhon is here, finally. Yes, I got my box in just in time, and I had to paint up the Tyranids. Today, I'm looking at kind of a different color scheme. I wanted to go like really bright and vibrant neon, but I decided to try something a little different. Like any good kid growing up in the 90s, I had a ton of Jurassic Park toys, and I always loved the color schemes on these dinosaurs. They were so iconic and so weird and wacky. They got some really cool like color blends, and I've decided to pick my favorites and recreate those with these Tyranid Raveners. So as you can see, I've unburied my old toys from the amber that they were stored in, and I've decided to take inspiration from some of these dinos. After going back and forth, I've picked my favorite 5 that I think will represent the Kill Team the best. For the Prime, I've got to go T-Rex, right? And it's the original T-Rex with this really cool red and green kind of underbelly. Love it, absolutely love it, iconic. And of course, you got to throw some raptors in there. So for this, I picked a Jurassic Park 1 raptor because I absolutely loved this raptor as a kid. And then I decided to go for a pretty unorthodox Jurassic Park 3 raptor because I always loved this sculpt. It's really interesting and weird. And of course, I mean, we have to, right? Alan! So I think I'm going to be using these for the Felltalon and the Tremorscythe. Next up, the Venomspitter. That's an obvious one. I love the Dilophosaur from the films, and I think this would translate over really nicely to the Venomspitter in the Kill Team. I'm going to try to recreate the frill on the back, but I didn't want to go for the classic Dilophosaur that you're probably thinking of. I decided to go for this one because it just has that little pop of red in there. And lastly, for the Wrecker, I've decided to go for the Pachycephalosaurus. This was another really cool toy. I was in the height of Jurassic Park 2 when it first came out, so the merchandising and the packaging is really, really nostalgic to my childhood, so I decided to go for this one. I was going to go for Stego, but the whole Kill Team seems to have red in it somewhere, and I like that unifying aspect across all 5 members. So I've decided to pick this one. Without further ado, let's jump in, starting with the Prime. With all these models, I'm base coating them in a black primer first, just to help the paint adhere to the model itself. And then I'm following that up with a zenithal of white from above. It doesn't have to be white. I'm going to be using a lot of base colors, and I'm actually going to be using a lot of airbrush as well. You could do this by hand, it might take you a little bit longer, but I just wanted a generic baseline for all of the models. And for the Prime here, I'm starting off with a burnt red, and I'm thinning this down with some airbrush thinner. I'm just applying this to basically the outside shell of the Tyranid, because I'm going to plan on doing almost like a two-tone effect. I could have sprayed this directly on the black primer, but I felt like the white underneath would really help the vibrancy of these colors. For the green belly, for this I'm using Sherwood green. I wanted kind of a pea green, almost like a lime green color. I'm kind of taking some creative liberty with the colors. I'm trying to match them as close as possible to the original dinosaurs, but I'm also just punching them up just a hair. And then I'm adding some black, just kind of a few puffs of black on the limbs themselves. Looking at the original Kenner toy, it has the claws in kind of a black color, so I'm just doing a straight coal black for the talons. And then I've decided to go in with that burnt red and just tidy up some of those overspill sections. I don't want to overcorrect too much because I like that gradient between the two colors, but places like here where the armor is kind of overlapping, I decided to go back in with the burnt red. I'm going to deviate from the original color scheme just a little bit and add some green sky to the kind of ribbed belly section of these Tyranids. For all of them, I'm just going to be going a shade higher just to kind of show that this is a different texture. And although this looks like the original toys, I'm going to add some of that grimdark, and by doing that I'm using Athonian Camoshade just to shade that green belly and add some grit and depth to the shadows. For the carapace itself, I'm using Caribou Crimson, and you could use a non-oil all over here, but I wanted to kind of color the shades dependent on what the base color was originally. So I'm going to be switching through a whole bunch of shades depending on the color of the dinosaurs. For the dorsal fin on the head, I'm using orange leather and just laying down a base coat ready for a shade and a highlight later on. And for the alien-like tongue hanging out of the mouth, I'm using ProAcryl's Pink. Although these are quite bright now, the shade will really darken these down. For some of the smaller details, I've decided to go with a Birch. And this is kind of an ivory color. I just wanted some off-white in there rather than just having a bright white highlight. And I'm gently dragging the brush over the teeth. And then I'm shading the tongue with some of that Caribou Crimson from earlier. I've decided to use a brownish wash for the dorsal fin, so this is Agrax Earthshade. And I'm just kind of letting that just soak in there. Again, you could use a generic wash all the way around, but I decided to use these specifically colored washes just to kind of help shade some of these areas. I'm adding a small dot of bold titanium white for the eye, followed by some fluorescent yellow. And that's because I want to recreate those original toys and draw attention to those creepy dinosaur-like eyes. I'm also doing a small line of black down the middle to kind of represent a reptilian eyeball. For the markings, I'm doing my best with some coal black just to kind of recreate some of those original shapes from the T-Rex. I'm not being too accurate. I don't really care so much here where it's like one-to-one. I just want to kind of capture the feel of that original toy. So these are kind of very thick blobs and abstract shapes just running all the way down the back. I'm going back in with that original green sky color, and now I'm starting to add some scratches to these belly plates here and just kind of build up those highlights just to add that tiny little bit extra detail to them. And the same principle applies to the dorsal fin, going back in with that orange leather and just building up those highlights. For this, I mixed in just a small amount of birch just to kind of create an ivory orangey color, and just slowly building that up just towards the edge of this fin here. And then followed by some pure birch on the smallest amount just on the edge. For the tongue, I'm just adding some of that original pink color back on as a small amount of highlight. And then for the armored carapace itself, I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet and just hitting some of these edges and bumps and creases just to kind of show that there's some highlights in here. I've decided to also create some of those original scratches that I did on the belly plates back on the model here on the back. For the claws, I've decided to go with a grey-blue. You could use just a neutral grey, but I wanted to add just a small amount of blue tone into the overall colour scheme, and so I'm just using this to create some very sketchy highlights. And then of course I'm just building that up to a white colour using a bold titanium white and just mixing that in stages. For the base, I'm going to be using ProAcryl's Grey Earth, and I'm just filling in some of the gaps where some of the sculpt obviously didn't reach the edge of the base. And then I'm really carefully adding in some neutral grey for the surrounding rocks and debris. If I was kind of using some foresight here, I probably wouldn't have glued it together. I probably would have left this as a separate piece. I'm finally adding just a little bit of dry brushing here, and I'm kind of recreating my recipe from my previous kill team for the Vulcus terrain. But I want to pay homage to some of that cool packaging and graphic design from the films and the toys, so I'm going to be adding some hazard stripes to some of the debris, starting off with a tau light ochre yellow as a base tone, and then some coal black just to create some of those stripes. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, these are kind of painted on and then destroyed, but they're really fun to do and you can kind of get carried away with it. I'm going to be shading the whole base in Coelia Green Shade. This is a really cool kind of blue-green color and it just mixes the two greys together nicely. I'm just taking extra care not to get it on the Ravener itself, but just going around and making sure that some of the rocks are shaded. And then I'm taking a damp brush and pulling away from the very top so I still get some of that gradient come through. Finally, a few drops of Agrax Earthshade while it's still wet helps just to kind of break up those tones and add some interest. And with that, the prime is done. Okay, onto the Raptor, the Felltalon. So for this, it's essentially the same recipe, just the colors are now changing. So I'm starting again with that tau light ochre. For all of these, I'm trying to stay within the same paint so that they all kind of feel like they're borrowing from the same palette. So here's some birch for the underbelly. And again, when it comes to the details on the airbrush, I'm not too worried about being too accurate because I can always correct the overspray. And so here's some burnt red, again borrowing from the T-Rex previously, but now I'm just running it down the back for the stripes. And I'm just making sure that I pay homage to the original paint schemes, but also kind of add the Warhammer twist to all of these. Finally, I'm just taking super care just to not overspray on some of these areas, but I do want to get that stripe running all the way down to the tip of the tail. Once the airbrushing is done, I'm then switching over to a hand brush and just filling in some of those tiger stripes that you see on the original toys. I like the fact that the airbrush kind of gets me most of the way there with the gradient, but I can then go back in with those details and really refine it. For the wash on this one, I'm going to be using Fuegan Orange, and I'm basically just covering all of the yellow and red sections and just letting it work its magic and go between those plates and between the scales and just pull out all that detail again. This also helps to bring that burnt red back into the kind of orangey spectrum and really kind of changes that red away from the original prime red that we used on the previous Ravener. I'm just going in with some of that birch and just tidying up some of these places that just got a little overspilled. And this is just great prep for another wash here, just because I want to make sure that the undercoats are there. And looking at the original toy, the mouth and the tongue are in this kind of cool brown color that really complements the red and the orange. So I've decided to kind of pick this out for a Mournfang brown, and I'm going to use this to highlight basically this Ravener's special abilities, which is the Felltalons. And I'm going to wash the front of this Ravener with a Seraphim Sepia. I did add a small amount of Lamia Medium, which is just kind of like an opacity, like a thinner. That's just going to take that down so it's not so strong, because I still want some of that white to show through. And this also helps to add kind of a dusty, grimy look to the model itself. For these talons, I'm going to be using a neutral grey, and that's because the original toy had kind of grey claws and nails. And again, this is just bringing it a little bit closer to the source material. I'm making sure to get all of the claws here. And then again, the same thing with the previous one, I'm using pink for the tongue. And then a birch, again, for the weird kind of bone claw thing on the tip of the tongue. I'm making sure to use the edge of the brush for the teeth, and then I'm covering all of those brown sections with the Agrax Earthshade from the previous model. Some Caribou Crimson all over the tongue here, and then I'm using a damp brush to kind of pull that away into the areas that I want to see it. And then while all of these washes are drying, I decided to go ahead and start the base again, like the previous one. This one doesn't have any debris or anything, so this is just going to be straight onto the base itself. For the eyes, I'm base coating them in a bold titanium white, followed by that fluorescent yellow again. And then a nice small line of black for the pupil. Once again, I'm going back through with those original colors and adding those small highlights and damages and scratches and things. It's an arduous process, but that extra 10% really helps to make these models shine. A quick couple of highlights on the talons themselves with some neutral grey, and then I'm building up to a white. And then I'm following those same steps from the previous base, which is just some very sporadic highlights, followed by the two shades that I used previously. Okay, it's time to fly through the rest of these because I can't wait to see them on the table. So I'm going to start by airbrushing the Tremorscythe with some of that birch color again, followed by a brown leather stripe down the back this time. And then again some of that burnt red just running down the middle. I'm using some old paper towel here and just kind of masking off while I hit the kind of frills along the top of the head here. This one had a lot of overspray, so I went back in with the brush and just tidied up some of those edges. As with the birch color on the previous models, I did the same thing again this time round, and again I thinned it down with some Lamia medium just to kind of help it flow and kind of dilute the mix just a little bit. There was nothing really too special about this one that was any different from the previous two, so I just went through the same old recipe by looking at the base colors, applying those, and then building up those highlights once the washes had dried. I did go back in and kind of boost up that red just a little bit with some of that Evil Sunz Scarlet from previously. And then I ended up using a fluorescent red to really punch that red color stripe down the back. I also paid homage to the original toys color markings with this nice light grey stripe, just gently running the brush down the back of the model. Once again, before I got back into the highlights, I decided to wrap up the base at this stage, just in case I made some mistakes. And then I decided to add some small extra highlights to this Tremorscythe just by dry brushing on some white and then going back in with those original colors like I did previously. I did add some striping with some Mournfang brown. This does get a little lost with all the details going on the chest, but because I kind of cut across some of those lines, it does stand out just a little bit more, especially on the back. Lastly, I finished out this JP3 Raptor with some edge highlights on the claws, and then my wash mixture that I was doing on the previous bases on this one. Okay, on to the Venomspitter. And this, again, is much the same story. We're base coating with a birch, followed by, this time, an Ardennes green for that really kind of nice color combination of the green and the ivory. I'm doing my best here to be as accurate as possible, but also kind of overspraying all over the place. I then switch to a burnt red, and I make sure I get that chin because that's such a defining feature of the original Kenner toy. I'm doing some very rough kind of frill pattern on the back here, and then I decided to shade the whole thing with Coelia Green Shade. We've been using it for the bases so far, but I figured this nice kind of blue-green would blend really nicely with this ivory-green combo. I went in and got all the talons with a coal black, and then I went to town with the Birch again, this time really going heavy on the highlighting just to make sure that I cover up most of that green color. I'm using a dark green-gray, and that's because I want to create kind of a two-tone effect from the dorsal sack thing to like the actual colors from the toy. And I'm pushing the boundaries here on the color scheme just a little bit because I'm kind of introducing a different type of green just to help distance from the other greens and the ivories and things like that. And because this was a decision that I was going back and forth on for a while, I've now decided to go in and use that Coelia Green Shade and really go heavy on the wash and help match that to the rest of the overall color scheme. It's time for the highlights, and I'm going back in with that Ardennes green. I'm making sure that I continue the trend of adding these little scratches to any of the harder surfaces on the model, so like the plates and some of the more scaly pieces. For the highlights, I've decided to go a little bit brighter on the white just to really help punch that white back out of that kind of blue shade. And then here I'm just using that pure white again, creating some of those scratches and more of those little storytelling elements on the back of the Ravener. The eyeball again is a fluorescent yellow. And then some very sketchy highlights on the sack on the back here, just kind of adding more and more of that birch into the color spectrum. By this point, my wet palette is just covered in stuff, so I'm just kind of picking colors that I feel would work well together. I'm making sure I get the base done, and then it's on to the final talon highlights. And with that, the Dilophosaurus is done. For the final Ravener, we come to the Pachycephalosaurus, or Ramhead if you're going off of the old packaging. So for the base coat on this one, I'm using green sky all over, followed by a black forest green for basically the main marking pattern just along the back here. That burnt red coming in clutch again to kind of highlight the head here, followed by just a small burst of birch just in the very top. Once that's dry, I'm then going back in with that black forest green and just adding in some very, very sketchy markings like you'd see on the original toy. I'm not too worried about being too accurate, I'm just kind of throwing it on there just to kind of get the impression across. For the shade on this one, I'm using Athonian Camoshade way back at the very beginning of the video. We're using it again here just to kind of shade the overall model. And then because the claws on the original toy were kind of a green color, I actually mixed in some Ardennes green into like a neutral gray and come up with this kind of dark green-gray color. The tongue and the surrounding mouth area I'm doing in that original pink. And of course, because he's got his mouth open nice and wide, we can get those teeth. The eye this time round, I'm actually using fluorescent red. And this is, again, the original toy has red eyes, so I figured I'd pay homage to that. And because I had such a great time doing some of that hazard striping, I'm doing it again here on this one. And of course, this is a Lost World toy, and that was the Lost World packaging. It's time for the highlighting stage, so here's just a quick supercut of all of the highlighting stages I did. This is just, again, the original base color on top. and then adding those scratches and wound marks to the back of the Tyranid using some of that black forest green mixed with just a small amount of the birch. Again, I mixed in some of that Ardennes green, and I'm building up a kind of green scale highlight for the claws. And that was pretty much it for the Wrecker. Welcome to Ravener Park. And here they are, the Kill Team. This was a really fun, really great trip down memory lane. There's some nostalgia here. I'm sure these are instantly recognizable colors to a lot of people, and I think this was just a really fun experiment to try to recreate some old school, like 90s airbrushing style toys in a modern day Warhammer setting. I really wanted something bright and vibrant, but also kind of unifying between the whole lot, and I think I was able to achieve that by using the same paints between them. As always, I would love to know what you think down in the comments below. What is your favorite one? And also, what's your favorite dinosaur? Or even your original favorite Kenner toys from the 90s? Let me know down in the comments. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. A huge thank you to my Patreons and my YouTube members. If you're interested in more content, go ahead and head over there. There's links down in the description below. If you like this kind of content and you're new here, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting also really helps me out as a small YouTuber. Thank you so much for watching, and life finds a way.